What Do You Do is a jobs and careers podcast dedicated to demystifying careers we don't know much about and exploring unique approaches on ones we think we do. I'm Adam from Dandelion Video Production, and each episode I'll be having honest conversations about what these careers actually involve. Today I'm here with Jill Roberts, a family lawyer, so if you're looking to understand a bit more about family law, thinking of getting into the field, or just want to have a nosy about Jill's job, this podcast is for you. Hi Jill, glad to have you.
Hi Adam, thanks very much for inviting me on. I'm excited to get chatting to you.
Great, me too. So let's start. What does a family lawyer do?
So, family lawyers can be very wide in terms of what they do. Put very simply for me specifically, if I can put it simply, I help clients going into relationships and also coming out of them. That's the simplest way that I can sort of put it. Some examples of what we do is, for me specifically, I deal with couples that are married, but also couples that aren't married as well. If they're married, I'll help them through the divorce process if they want to bring the marriage to an end. I also help them deal with the finances that might be off the back of that. So it may be that they have property together that they need to sort out, other capital assets, maybe business assets, maybe inheritance, that kind of thing, pensions, income, so child maintenance, sometimes spousal maintenance as well, so help them sort out those kind of issues. If they've got any children together as well, if they need any help sorting out that side of things as well, I'll also help them with that. So that could be, for example, helping them sort out the arrangements for the children, like how much time they're going to spend with each parent. It can also lead into things where they can't agree welfare issues, for example, or things like schooling. Or I've got one at the moment where somebody wants to relocate to a different area with the children. And so if one parent doesn't want the other parent to move, that can sometimes become an issue that they need help with. So there's some examples. Also, I deal with people where there's domestic abuse involved. And so there may be times where they need to get an order to keep them safe, which is called an injunction. So I deal with that as well, and also deal with enforcement of orders. For people going into relationships, I also deal with prenuptial agreements and postnuptial agreements if they are already married, and also cohabitation agreements as well. I don't specifically deal with this, but family lawyers as well, also when it comes to children, can also deal with what we call public side law, which is where children's services would get involved, and it may be that there are safety issues, so welfare issues that social services need to get involved, and it may be that they need to be taken into care. I don't specifically deal with that myself, but that is another area that some family lawyers do deal with as well.
So it's not just the sort of organising the paperwork of like divorces and prenuptial and things before. It is more intensive, more, I suppose, traumatic aspects of dealing with things like domestic abuse and helping where children, deciding where children need to go. Sorry.
Yeah, it can be, and one thing I would say is that domestic abuse can turn up in all sorts of areas, in all sorts of walks of life, and there's also lots of different forms of it as well, and so that is something that's we do come across, not always, but that is an area that we can help with as well. So, I specifically deal with a little bit more sort of the financial side of things, but it is something that we can. A family lawyer is very wide in terms of what they can do. Yeah, it's and I don't think people realise that, particularly the planning side of things that I was talking about with the prenups and the postnuptial agreements. I think when somebody says family law to somebody, they automatically sort of think about, I suppose, what I call the distress side of it. It's the coming out of the relationship. But I think people don't realise that actually we can help with the planning side of things as well. So making sure that when you're going into a relationship, whether that's buying a house with somebody, that you're making sure that actually you realise what you're doing with that property. Because particularly, let's say, for example, if you're buying a house and you're not married, let's say you contribute, your deposit isn't the same, and if you were then to separate and sell the house, would you want it 50-50, or would you want your share of the deposit back if you put more or less in? And so there are things that can be drawn up, such as a cohabitation agreement or a trust deed, that can set that out, because if it's not set out, it can lead later to further argument, and so actually putting that planning in place can make things more clear at the outset for people. That's the same with prenuptial agreements and postnuptial agreements. So what a prenuptial agreement is you're effectively agreeing what would happen with your finances if the marriage was to go on and break down. And there's lots of pros and cons to pre and post-nuptial agreements, emotive side, but they are very useful tools for people, particularly if they've got business assets that they may want to try and protect, or inheritance, or family giving gifts to people, for example, or they're just, doing financial planning that actually they would rather know and have that conversation whilst they're in a good place, rather than trying to have that conversation when the relationship's broken down and the emotions are heightened. It's a much more difficult conversation to have than rather than when you're in a good place and you have that conversation, and as I say, it's clear from the outset. So I think that's the side of things that family lawyers do that people don't realise sometimes. So
no, I didn't until I spoke with you the first time. So I appreciate you explaining that. Let's stick with the example of the not well balanced deposit.
Yeah.
So what? Let's say there's the couple that did get the agreement and the couple didn't. When you reach the stage where that needs to be resolved, how do they differ?
So if you've got a trust deed or a cohabitation agreement in place, is that what you mean? Sorry.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So because you've set that out quite clearly in those documents, it's a document that's enforceable, that if later on there was an argument to say, actually, it should be 50-50, let's say the person that put less of the deposit in turned around and said, I want it to be 50-50 because it's quite... so on the legal title, you would have that it was joint, the property would be held jointly. So the legal status is that you both own it 50-50. What we're talking about is the beneficial interest, so the money that's in the property. And you might not want that to follow what the legal title says, so 50-50. And so, like I said, because if you contributed unequally to a deposit, for example, so what that document does is clearly sets out the intention, and there's a document that's enforceable, that if there are any disputes later on, so let's say the person that didn't contribute as much says, oh no, I want it to be 50-50 now because it's joint, there is a document clearly setting out what the intentions are and what that should be. So it can avoid costly litigation later on, because particularly with non-married couples, the law is very outdated, hasn't been updated for a long time, and it goes under very strict law and trust law, rather than different law that governs if you were married, and it can be complicated to sort out.
So in that situation, it would be a long, costly process of trying to figure out who's owed what, and it might not even be fair anymore based on how old the law is.
Potentially, and another thing to think about with those kind of things is that things change. You buy a property together, you might contribute unequally. Then later on, let's say you do some renovations to the house. How's that going to be dealt with? Because those renovations have cost whoever. How's that going to? It's another conversation then to have. Do you see what I mean? It's about setting out clearly what intentions are, so that later on there's no room for dispute later on.
Yeah. I imagine a lot of people would say, "Oh, is this really necessary? We're happily married. Like there's no chance of our marriage breaking down." But I suppose you deal with a lot of people that have said that in the past and it hasn't worked out. So what would you say to someone who said that to you?
Yeah, I mean, it's I get what people say, and I think you're talking probably more about the pre-nuptial agreements and post-nuptial agreements there, because obviously cohabitation agreements is really for non-married.
Oh yeah, sorry, I'm jumping around a bit here.
That's really fine. That's fine. But I'm actually glad you said that, because it's easy to get confused with it, and so. But the pre-nuptial agreements are if you're thinking of getting married. So. When you do get married, again, a lot of people don't realise, they think, getting married is just a piece of paper, it doesn't really change anything. When it comes to actually your legal status, it does change a lot. It changes, as I said earlier, the law that governs you when you're married and when you're not married is very different. And so if you were to separate, the law it is very different, and how it works out is very different compared to if you're not married. Excuse me. And so prenuptial agreements are having that conversation before you get married about what is going to happen. And I understand what you're saying in terms of, we're happily married would be a postnuptial agreement because you'd already be married. But I can see that conversation also happening if you were talking about a prenuptial agreement. You think, well, I'm not going into this marriage thinking it's going to break down, etc., etc. And nobody ever does, and it's not a case of you're saying it's definitely going to, but it's just having that conversation that if it does, it's not just because you've had that discussion and you've set out what would happen if that event was to happen. That doesn't mean your marriage is going to break down, and if it doesn't, then that's fine, and great. But actually, if it does happen, again, one of the pros to doing it is it actually, because you've already had those conversations, is that actually can again save some costly litigation later on. Particularly if you've got, as I mentioned earlier, assets involved such as businesses, because people don't realise how much somebody getting divorced can affect a business sometimes, particularly if it's a business that's run by a husband and wife. How's that business then going to go on and continue to work going forward from there? Or it might be just a wife or a husband is a shareholder in a business. The family courts, they're quite far-reaching, and people don't realise that actually that can have a knock-on effect on the business. So it's not only protecting you, it's protecting your other shareholders and the rest of the business as well. Other things that can be, complicated to sort out can be inheritance. If people were to inherit money, would they want that to be protected? Would they want that to be shared if they were split up? People gifting money, parents particularly gifting money to children, again, that can be a difficult area to sort out later on if you've not had that conversation at the time. Was that gift to both of them, or was that gift to your child? And it's again about making things clear. That they quite often come up with, not so much inheritance, but gifts quite often come up with post-nuptial agreements, particularly with all the changes with the taxes at the moment and so and things, and so people have been, crikey voice, making the decision to gift more to children. Are you gifting to those children if they're married? Are you gifting to both of them, or are you just gifting to one of them? And this is what pre- and post-nuptial agreements can help sort out. And if you are trying to sort that out later, like I said, you're not always, you're in a very emotive place when a relationship breaks down. And particularly if you've got children, actually what you want your focus to be on when you are separating is the children, and making sure that they're okay and that they're processing everything and dealing with the separation. And actually, if you've already had those conversations about the finances with a prenuptial agreement or a postnuptial agreement, it's already made clear what's going to happen with the finances. Actually, you can go, oh, well, we've already talked about this. We know what's going to happen for that. And so actually, we can concentrate on the children, So there's lots of pros and cons with them. But, I have spoken to a lot of people that have said exactly the same as you. Well, why would I bother? I mean, and that's some of the reasons why you would. But equally, I can see that they're very emotive subjects for people. And also, like I said, it's a planning side of things. And sometimes having conversations about money isn't always easy.
No. That's a good point, actually. I was thinking, your explanation has made me realise your explanation has made me realise and see it in a different way, because, I mean, we don't want to use our car insurance.
Yeah.
We don't want to use our life insurance.
No.
But in the event that you need it, it's better to have it than it is to not have it. And it's just like we can't predict the future.
Yeah, exactly. It's one way of looking at it. I wouldn't quite say it's insurance, but it's a conversation you've already had. I suppose one thing that is slightly different is one thing that is really advisable with a particularly prenuptial agreement or even a postnuptial agreement is that you review them. So if you do a prenuptial agreement before you get married, you should review them as your marriage progresses. So, for example, if you go on to have children, or there's any major changes in your financial situation, or at least every 3 to 5 years, because people's lives change and situations change, and you can't always account for everything initially, because you don't, like I said earlier, you can't predict the future. So you should review them. But you're right, it's kind of a comparison in that you don't want to use your car insurance. People make wills, which is always advisable. Not something that I deal with, but I have lots of colleagues that do. But obviously, because it's a planning thing, isn't it? Nobody wants to think about the fact that they will eventually die. But I mean, slightly different. There's not a guarantee that your marriage would break down, but there's a possibility that it could. Yeah,
and like you're saying, with the reviewing, it's even more important because if children come into the equation, then it's even more important to make sure they're secure and they're safe, rather than have some months-long costly argument where you decide where they go or who they stay with. It's best to get that stuff reviewed and locked in, and at least then, if it happens, you're prepared, I suppose.
Yeah, and it's you're able to, because you're not dealing with the financial side of things, as I said, because you've already had those conversations. You can concentrate on your children, making sure your children are dealing with the separation or adapting, and your focus can be more on where that should be in terms of helping them through that process, rather than what's going to happen with the finances and all of the anxiety and the stress that can come along with that as well. So
yeah, absolutely. I imagine both all the different things that you approach, they require a lot of skills. What skills would you say are essential to your job and makes you good at it?
Well, I think there's probably two things. There's skills for a lawyer and skills for a family lawyer. I think for a family lawyer specifically, it's really important that actually you are able to be empathetic, because that's a big part of what you do. A big part of what I do is being able to understand clients' needs and anxieties, and help them through that process, managing that side of things as well. I mean, I do work quite closely along with people such as who are counsellors and divorce coaches and that kind of thing, that are specifically trained to help clients through emotions and things on that side of things. But I've been doing this for a while now, so so it is a part of the job in helping them through that side of things. And I suppose that's a skill that's developed over time as a family lawyer, in terms of how you do that, and because each client has different needs, each client has different anxieties, and it's understanding that, and also being that person that actually is slightly emotionally disconnected from what's going on for them, because actually they do need somebody with a level head and that can give them practical advice, because emotions can cloud judgment sometimes. And so that's part of what my job is as well, is to be able to be that person that's not so entrenched with all the emotions and everything that they've got going on, to try and be that voice of reason and that level-headedness. So
yeah, absolutely.
So that's a skill, which can be developed over time. I think it's really a job, a family lawyer. You really got to love it. You've got to be passionate about it, because it is quite challenging. And so I think if you are not passionate about it and don't really care about your clients, then it's something that you would struggle with, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay.
So.
Yeah.
But other more practical skills, just for being a lawyer, obviously, you've got your, communication skills, your written skills, being able to advocate, obviously, for your clients. So there's those kind of skills as well that go along in general with being a lawyer, time management, that kind of thing. But yeah, I'd say for a specific family lawyer, they're sort of probably the biggest skills that you would need to develop. And obviously legal knowledge, that's always help.
Yeah, a little bit, yeah. Yeah.
But I suppose I'm talking about more soft skills, really, rather than some of the obvious ones, really.
Yeah. So I guess it boils down to understanding, but not being in the trenches with them. You need to maintain that objectivity so that you can get the best outcome, rather than be engulfed in the situation like they are.
Yeah, and it's quite easy for clients. Lots of clients do this, and I completely understand why, is that they get so entrenched in the moment, sometimes they can't see into the future, and that's what sometimes they can make decisions based on the here and now, because they just want out of that situation. They just need to not be dealing with it, but actually that could, later on, is trying to sometimes say, look, we're trying to build a platform here for your future as well. And so it's sometimes trying to get clients to understand that it's not just about the here and now, it's about your future. Yeah,
of course. You touched on it a bit briefly there, but how do you manage to deal with these distressing situations?
The odd glass of wine helps. But obviously not at work.
yeah, of course.
Afterwards, I'm only human. I do have cases that sometimes they do affect you because of the nature of what's involved. But as I said, I think it's really just grounding yourself in terms of, as I mentioned earlier, you being that level-headed person in their lives at that time to give them that practical advice. And I think that helped be, for me personally, that's what helps me to be able to get them through that and sort of put my own feelings or emotions to one side for it, is because I know by being that sound person that they can speak to is that's how I can benefit them most at that time with my skills. So does that make sense?
Oh no, it does as well. I think so. I suppose as well, it does help that you're passionate about it, because it's like doctors are passionate about healing people, even though it's very incredibly stressful, but they wouldn't do it if they didn't want to do it. So because you care so much, it's a bit easier to maintain that objectivity and also to get through the tough times as well.
Yeah, I think it is. Family law is quite different to a lot of areas of law, because other areas of law can be quite transactional. So, and I think if you were thinking about a career in law, there's lots of different areas that you can go into. One of the reasons, like I said, it because of my personality and what I find rewarding in life. That's why I went into family law, really, because, like you say, I do care about it and I'm quite passionate about it. But that's not for everybody. It doesn't suit everybody's personalities. I've got colleagues at work that were like, I couldn't do your area of law. I just couldn't do it. And I get that. It's if you're thinking about a career in law, and a good piece of advice would be to try different areas of law, because you've got to find the one that suits you. But family law is not. It's not what I would call transactional. So you're very much involved. You get to know the ins and outs of people's lives. It's very personal, but also as well, that does help us sort of be quite holistic with our clients in terms of understanding their situation. And so it might not just be me that they actually need help from. They may need help from other colleagues as well. And actually, I do get to know my clients very well, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
But in a way, that also helps, because it helps understand what they actually do need help with. I mean, it might not always just be me. So yeah, and it is different from other areas of law. You might have sort of property. I'd probably say it's a bit more transactional. It's buying or selling a house, and you're probably involved for, depending on how long it goes on, 6 to 12 weeks, something like that. My cases can go on, depending on how complex they are. I can have a client for over a year sometimes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, that's quite a lot of time to invest in someone's life. So yeah.
Yeah.
You're saying starting a career in law and moving around. How did you get into family law?
So I got into family law fairly early on in my career. I've mostly done family law. That's mostly what I've done. But I did do some other areas of law when I was training. As I said earlier, it's quite a good idea to do that, so that you can find the area of law that best suits you and best suits your personality. But I got into family law fairly early on and decided that's what I wanted to do. Normally when you qualify, you do tend to specialise in an area of law. Suppose, to use your comparison earlier, it's a little bit like a doctor. A doctor will specialise in a particular area of the body, won't they? It's a bit like law. Yeah. They will specialise in an area of law. You do have crossover, as I said. So I work with a lot of colleagues that specialise in the other areas, and talk to them on a regular basis, because there's lots of crossover with law. So sometimes it's not just one lawyer you sometimes need a team.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's like I say, I got into it quite early on, so I've been doing it. I'm not going to tell you how long I'm doing it.
That's your decision.
A while now.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I guess. So what drew you to family law, or is it kind of what we already covered, I suppose?
Yeah. Well, yeah. I suppose it was, like I said. When I did my training, I did some other areas of law. Like I did a bit of property. I did a little bit of criminal law, which was not for me. I really enjoyed studying it. But again, this is another sort of, if you're ever thinking of a career in law, what you study in law, studying it, and then actually doing it in practice can be two different things. Right. I definitely found that with criminal. I found criminal law very interesting to study, but then when I did a little bit of it in my training, really wasn't for me.
Okay.
So there's it's good to try different areas of law. So.
Yeah. In terms of training to become a lawyer, I suppose it's not that different for different disciplines, but how long does it take, and what's involved in the training?
Well, so there are lots of different routes into law. It used to be, years and years ago, it used to be very traditional. You had to do a law degree, had to go off and do either your LPC or your bar course, depending if you want to be a solicitor or a barrister. So there's different types of lawyer as well. But it has opened up a lot now, and so there are lots of different routes into law now. So you can, if you decided to do a degree in something else, you can convert that degree later on, and then go into law that way. There's things like solicitor apprentices now, where you basically study and work at the same time. So you can do it that way. There are other things like Silex, for example, where again, very similar, where you work and you qualify as you go along. So actually law is becoming much more accessible now, and it's not a case of actually, if you are doing your A-levels or whatever and you're not sure what you want to do, even if you're not sure if law is what you want to do right now, you can always go into it later on. I've got colleagues that law is a second career for them. They've done something else and come into it later on in life. But there's lots of transferable skills with being a lawyer, and so one way and the other. So you could have had a previous career, and there's lots of skills that you can then bring in from that career into a law career. Marketing's always a good one. Different as in not necessarily to do the law, but if you're in a business and you're wanting to develop that business and help develop that business, and as you qualify, if you want to become part of that business, that's always a useful tool to understand a business and understand how that works and how you can market it and how you can do business development and things like that. That's so if you came from that can be a useful skill to transfer. But even just customer service skills as well. We have clients, any skills that you have that you can deal with. Let's say a customer that's being difficult, and you develop those skills in terms of how you would deal with that. It's all transferable skills, so it can be that way. Or equally, if you go into law and decide it's not for you, there's lots of transferable skills you can take as a lawyer and then go on and have another career, So it is becoming much more accessible, and there are lots of different routes in now. And like I said earlier, there's different types of lawyer as well. So traditionally, sort of solicitor, barrister. There are others as well, but they're sort of the main two. I can explain the difference if you'd like me to, but it's up to you.
No, I think we're focusing on family law. I think just here, I can always ask the lawyers about those things later on. So if you've got any colleagues to recommend, let me know. But in terms, so we've covered how you got into it, and we've covered sort of the different routes that other people could take. I suppose I'm going into sort of why would someone become a lawyer, but what's the most rewarding part of being a family lawyer?
I suppose I covered it a little bit earlier, but what I find most rewarding is being able to help the clients through that process and giving them, as I said earlier, the platform to then move on positively with their future and see them then thrive going forward from there. I find that rewarding, being able to do that and help them through. The other thing that one of the things that reasons I went into this particular area and why I find it rewarding is that, as I said earlier, each client has different needs and anxieties, but each family situation is unique. There may be common themes that run through it, but there's so much nuance to it, and there are so many different dynamics and situations that can come up. Being able to apply my skills and knowledge to that, and each being slightly different, I enjoy that, and I enjoy being able to do that. So that's what, me personally, that's what I find rewarding, as in helping them through the process and then them coming out the other end and having a positive future. But also for me personally, I like the challenge, I suppose, of being able to adapt my skills and my knowledge to each individual circumstances.
No, that's what I like about this as well, because you meet with different people and they all want different outcomes, and it's the puzzle of figuring out how best to present them with the skills that you've developed over however many years you've been doing it. So that's exactly what I do too. That's why I like being a videographer.
I'm quite a people person, so I enjoy talking to people and getting to know what makes them tick. So that's probably why I like doing this area of law as well.
Yeah. I think we've kind of covered the most challenging aspects as well. Well, I suppose I'll just ask again just to make sure. What are the most challenging aspects of what you do?
Well, okay, so I'm going to be quite honest with this because I'm going to say something that probably you wouldn't expect me to say.
Okay.
The obvious one that you'd find challenging, which you do find challenging, is the emotive side of it. Of course, that is. One of the things the unexpected thing that I'm going to say that I find quite challenging is actually not everybody, but some people not giving the respect to the knowledge, expertise, the value that we bring and the support that we bring to people and offer to clients, or being unrealistic with their expectations. So,
Okay.
And that can happen. So, for example, and like I say, this is not everybody, but sometimes I can have people go, "Oh, really need your help, Jill. Can you sort out my divorce? Can you sort out my finances? Can you sort out my children? And can you do it all for 200 quid?" You know,
Yeah.
and I find that quite challenging aspect of the work, that sometimes people don't realise the support and the value that we add to this, and that can be quite challenging sometimes, I think. So,
Okay.
like I said, it's not an expected answer, but it's definitely an aspect that comes into what I do.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I suppose in some ways it's quite a lot of invisible labour to it.
Yeah.
So that's why it's not perceived as value, because it's just like, what are you really doing? It's just like, you've sent me a letter, like, but how much? Oh, I'm really summarising here.
Yeah.
I really like, but it's just like, well, how much effort went into that? How much research went into that? How many
Yeah.
conversations did you have to make sure you had all the information?
Yeah, but to go back to your point earlier, you know, most lawyers can train to. I think you asked this, but I'm not sure I actually answered it. Sorry, but you can train for years to become a lawyer. So the skills and the expertise that you build up, and like it's exactly what you say. It's like, how much has that gone into doing that letter, or that is that? Well, actually, it's gone 5 to 7 years of training. Actually, it's gone into
Yeah.
that of me knowing how to do that, and how to give you that advice, etc., etc. And you're right. I think it comes down to tangibility, like, and people realising the value and the worth that you're adding to that. Because if you walk into a shop and you buy a TV, you're taking something away, aren't you? Whereas what we give, obviously, it does add value. It's advice. It's helping them through that situation. But it's not something so tangible that they can see right now. If that makes
Yeah.
sense. I suppose it's slightly different with finances, but particularly if you're sorting out children, but then equally you're talking about your children's lives, you know, you're talking about your lives, you know, how much value do you put on that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, to the last point, I was actually just thinking as well as how similar it is to video as well, because it's like a 3-minute video. It didn't take 3 minutes to make.
Yeah,
It took
exactly. Yeah,
maybe a couple of days to get all the cuts right and listen to all the footage and understand exactly what's being said and figure out the best way to present it. And it's not quite, it's like, it's still, I suppose it's slightly more tangible, but it's still, you still don't see all the effort that goes into it, so you assume that it isn't going to be good value. I was going to say expensive, but also good value at the price. So yeah.
I suppose so. Like I say, it's not everybody. You know, lots of people do understand and do value everything, but it's definitely a challenging area of what we do. Is that side of things? So
Yeah. I suppose ultimately, would you want someone to sort out all that for £200?
I would love that.
Yeah, it's like, what result are you going to get for £200 if you do all that? I'm not quite sure that would.
Yeah. I mean, I was probably being a bit extreme there, but
Okay, yes, but yeah.
Yeah.
But still, like, what result can you expect for that? It's just like, yeah.
Yeah. Well, we don't get much for £200 these days, do you? Actually.
No, exactly. Right. So, how do you handle a case where there's no good outcome?
Well, I suppose I'm gonna do a very lawyer answer here.
Okay.
I suppose what a good outcome, I suppose, is subjective. So I suppose it depends on the situation. I'm being quite evasive here because it can be all sorts of situations. So
Yeah.
I suppose if I give you examples, let's say finances, for example, we will always give advice as you go along about. There's always going to be an outcome in what we do, because ultimately, if I do it very simply, we're either sorting out finances for people or we're sorting out what's going to happen with the children. You know, so there's going to be an outcome, whether or not that's what your client wants the outcome to be, that's different. And I suppose part of the job is initially is explaining to them what the possible outcomes are as best you can, because you can never be 100% certain, particularly if you go down the court route and you then ultimately putting your life into a judge's hands to decide for you. But yeah, there's always going to be an outcome. I suppose at the beginning is like I said, is trying to explain to them what those possible outcomes can be, and if they don't perceive that to be a good outcome, is being quite honest and frank with them at the beginning about what realistically they could hope to achieve from what they're trying to achieve. There's no point in, at the outset, if a client has very unrealistic expectations of what's going to happen, you need to be honest about that and upfront about that straight away, because there's no point going down and ultimately then spending lots of costs going down that route if that's what they pay you for. They pay us to advise them, what is best to do. And ultimately, if we don't think that argument's going to be successful or as successful as they would like it to be, that's part of what we have to do, and we have to manage that. I'm not. There are some circumstances where there'd be no good outcome, I suppose, in terms of. But then it's telling and being frank with them about that. That actually that the argument that they're wanting to pursue or the outcome they're looking to achieve is potentially not achievable. So, it's quite subjective in terms of what a good outcome and what is not, and managing that. Does that sort of answer the question?
Because I suppose as well, it's just like not every the client comes to you with their issue, and like you can't just say some magic words and they win regardless of how good a lawyer you are. It's like
exactly.
like reality is only so wide, and like there's only so many different options. So it's just managing expectations, I guess, was the answer to that question, and you covered it. So that makes sense to me. Yeah. But you didn't raise a point there, which relates back to something we said earlier about isn't it better to have those plans in place, whether it's a cohabitation agreement, prenuptial, postnuptial, or whatever, rather than have your decision handed to someone else, which is a judge.
Well, that's part of the pros in terms of obviously sort of doing those doing those prenuptial agreements, is that you actually have already had those conversations, and so it's already set out. I mean, with a prenuptial agreement, what I will say is that unlike in sort of America, where it's you sign a contract and once you've signed it, that's it. That's enforceable, and that is what happens. With prenuptial agreements, the courts do still retain that if there's an element of unfairness to it, particularly if there's children involved, they can overturn them, because so what the courts weren't willing to do when prenuptial agreements were being introduced was to completely give up what they call their jurisdiction to overturn them, because I think they were concerned about some elements of vulnerability for some people. So there's lots of, I won't go into it today unless you want me to later, but there's lots of things that you have to put in place with these kind of agreements to make them as enforceable as possible, such as legal advice, making sure there's full disclosure so people are as aware as they can be going into them. But they do ultimately they can still overturn them later on. However, if you have one in place and it's done properly and it's fair, it's very much on the party trying to get out of it than the party trying to trying not to get out of it, if you see what I mean, to show why they should. And if there's nothing there, then you're starting from scratch. The whole conversations are starting from scratch. But if you've already got a prenuptial agreement there, you've got, even if they overturn slightly, some deviate from it slightly, it is a basis there for you that you've already worked on, or it will be completely enforced completely if somebody tries to later on. But equally, if you've had those conversations and both parties still agree, when the marriage breaks down, if it breaks down, if nobody disagrees with it, that's what happens. It simply gets it gets converted into an order once you break down, and then that agreement then gets implemented.
I guess it just makes things simple rather than having
it makes it more simple. Whereas if you're starting from scratch, you've not even had those conversations. I mean, we'd always try and keep things out of court. Court is a last resort, because, as I said earlier, you're putting yourself into somebody else's hands that's going to ultimately decide if you get that far in the court process. And so we always encourage try and keep things out of court if we possibly can, because actually it's clients' lives. You know, they should make the decisions about what's going to happen. The court is there as a backup if they really can't decide.
Yeah.
But yeah, so even if they don't have a prenuptial agreement or anything like that in place, and they are starting from scratch, we always say try and keep it out of court if possible. If it has to go to court, it's not the end of the world. You know, it's not. It's because there's situations there and circumstances that necessitate that. But we will always try and look at other options. So, you know, just solicitors dealing with it out of court for you, so and trying to resolve matters that way. There's other options such as mediation that people can go to. There's other forms of what we call non-court dispute resolution as well that we could look into to try and help parties resolve things, and on as best we can on terms that they're then comfortable with. Because if you go to court, like I said, ultimately, if you go to a final hearing, you're asking somebody else to make that decision about your life for you, and you're handing your life over to somebody else.
Yeah, yeah.
And there's an element of what we call litigation risk because you're in court proceedings, and so, you know, we can advise clients within a certain, you know, to a certain degree, but judges have very wide powers of discretion in family proceedings, and so you can never say exactly what a judge is going to do. You can say within a ballpark, but you can't say exactly. And you can also get two judges that hear exactly the same case, exactly the same facts, but will come out with two different outcomes.
Right.
But because they have wide powers of discretion, they're still within the law. So, that's what I was saying about the litigation risk, is that you are handing it over to a third party, and you can never say with certainty exactly what is going to happen. You can say. So actually, we really encourage clients to try and maintain some control over their own lives and make decisions that at least they can be comfortable with, if that makes sense. So.
Yeah. How many cases do go to court? I suppose a proportion or a...
It varies. Obviously, you know, we deal with, you know, cases at a time. It does vary. You know, sometimes I can have a few in court, or sometimes I can have none in court. You know, it really depends on the parties and what their needs are, and, you know, what their circumstances are. But it's becoming less and less. The proportion is becoming less and less that will go to court. Lots of reasons: cost, delay with the courts. Obviously, you know, the courts are under a lot of pressure at the moment, and so there's quite a lot of delay within the courts, and so we will always try other options rather than go to court. So it's getting less and less, and those options, so those non-court dispute options are becoming more widely used and more widely known as well.
Yeah. Going down that track, what's your sort of day-to-day like?
Oh, again, very varied.
yeah, I can imagine, yeah.
So it varies. I mean, sometimes I could be in the office, I can be seeing clients, I can be existing ones or seeing new ones, can be doing meetings, so that could be with other experts, it could be with barristers, it could be with clients, doing telephone, doing drafting of documents, I could be in court, you know, there's lots of things. I also do lots of things that are not sort of client related, and in terms of I'll do like business development and things like that, supervision, team meetings, that kind of thing as well. So the side of things, I think, you know, particularly thinking of going into law, that you think, oh, I'm just going to go and I'm going to do the law, and it's going to be like Suits.
Yeah.
And you walk around and wave a bit of paper. Not quite like that. But there's a side of things that people perhaps don't think about. It's not just doing the law. There's, you know, you're in a business, so you're helping to run that business as well if you get to that level, and so there's lots of other things that are involved as well as doing the law and as well as helping clients. So.
Yeah. I think the comparison to suits as well, I suppose. Are there any other misconceptions about being a family lawyer?
Well, I mean, in suits they're corporate lawyers, so that's again different area.
Yeah.
And it's in America.
Yeah.
Again, different. But yeah, it's not quite as in suits. In suits, they wave around very thin files of paper and get a court hearing the next day, and it's all dealt with. But and not. I mean, we have our odd glamorous moments, but not quite as glamorous as I'd say.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Are there any other any other sort of misconceptions generally about family law that people tend to just completely misunderstand?
I mean, I suppose being a little bit more serious, I think I think one of probably the biggest misconceptions with family lawyers in particular is that people will say, "Oh, if don't get lawyers involved, we won't be amicable then." The majority of family lawyers that I know have the best intentions of their clients and will work to get them the best outcomes and to just help resolve the situation. They're not there to make things worse. They're there to help. And lots of people, I think there's a misconception is that if you get lawyers involved, is that they're just going to make things worse, they're going to charge you loads of money, and we're not going to be amicable anymore, and we're just going to fall out, you know? So
that's definitely on TV, isn't it? Where it's just like, you sit in the room and not talk to each other, the lawyers can do all the talking. Yeah.
The majority of family lawyers that I know, that's not their approach, you know, and they just want to help clients find resolutions, but equally, it's a very daunting situation to be in if you're trying to navigate through that, and you know, we've been doing this, you know, I've been doing it a long time, lots of lawyers are very, you know, experienced, and that's what you're asking help for, you know.
Yeah, I suppose it goes back to what you were saying about it's not a transactional part of the law, I suppose it's more collaborative, and you can't just say, oh, child should go here. It's like that's someone's life that you're completely uplifting. It's got to be handled delicately, and you can't just barrel in and say, and there's not necessarily going to be easy solutions, are there?
Yeah, exactly. And in that particular situation that you just described there, what about the child?
Yeah.
How do you feel about it?
Yeah.
You know, because obviously they're going through that as well. So there's lots of dynamics to it that you know, requires some delicate balance, and you know, there's a lot. You know, everybody's different. Everybody's got different personalities. Comes down to what we were saying earlier about outcomes and, you know, what people perceive as good outcomes. You know, it's understanding that and seeing how that can be achieved and how that family can then move forward. So
yeah, I think as well that's kind of it's better to get a positive outcome, or it's better to get an outcome that has been sort of agreed positively amongst all the parties, rather than keep fighting and end up with probably even bigger fallout than what you started with.
Yeah, and you know, the clients need to think very carefully, particularly if you've got children. How do you want to treat the other person? Because lawyers aren't going to be involved with your lives afterwards.
Yeah.
Do you want to completely destroy the trust between both of you and everything? Because you're going to have to go on with your lives moving forward. What do you want that to look like out the other end?
Yeah.
So, and that's something to think about quite carefully in terms of how you approach things.
Yeah. No, that's a very interesting perspective. I'd not considered that as well, because again, I've not considered ever getting divorced. So
there's quite a lot of myths around family law in general as well. Not just about a family lawyer, but in family law, there's lots of misconceptions. One of them, obviously, we talked about prenups a bit. One of them is that they're not worth the paper they're written on. Kind of gone into that a little bit, but that's quite a common misconception. Some of the misconceptions are common law husband and wife. Ever heard that term? So
I have. Yeah.
So lots of people still think that actually, it's like we touched on this earlier, that if you've been together in a relationship, you're not married, but you've been together for a certain amount of time, you get the same rights as you do a married person, but you don't.
Right.
Yes. So that's quite a big misconception. Other ones would be so quite a lot of times, because quite often people will come to me and they're like, we've already agreed, even if they don't have a prenuptial agreement, but we've sat down, we've talked about it, we've already agreed what we're going to happen with the finances. Okay, that's fine. Okay, what some people don't realise is that, so if you're getting divorced, you've got to go through the divorce process to bring the marriage to an end. That's the process to bring the marriage to an end. But the finances, even when you get what's called your final order in your divorce and says you're no longer married, it doesn't sever the financial ties you have with each other. And so even when you're divorced, even if you've sorted out the finances, it leaves potential claims open at a later date for people to still make a claim.
Right.
And so you have to have an additional order which sets out what you're going to do. First of all, to make sure you have something to enforce if they don't do what they say they're going to do. But second of all is to sever those ties and to make what we call a clean break, if that's achievable, so that then it protects any future assets that you've got going forward. So, for example, let's say you got divorced, you did sort all the finances out, but you didn't get that order. Let's say you won the lottery in the future.
Yeah.
They might try and make a claim, or you inherit some money, or something happens.
Right, yeah.
Not necessarily saying they'd be successful, but they could still try.
Okay.
And some may, particularly if it's a lottery win. So that's again something that lots of people don't realise, that you actually do need this additional order in finances to just make sure you're protecting any future assets.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's probably a good point to come on, because it's to finish on. I mean, because I think the last thing we've discussed in the last few minutes is just how getting lawyers involved will definitely have a better outcome than if you just kind of scramble around, because there's just so much complexity to it, and there's so much ill will which could be solved with a bit more objectivity and a bit more expertise than just.
I guess on a final point, what I would say is I'd always say to people, it will be beneficial for you to get advice. The level of advice that you want, that's down to you, but it's always beneficial to get advice. And my advice would be to get it as early as possible, so that you don't accidentally put yourself in a situation that you perhaps didn't mean to. So.
Yeah, that's good advice. Speaking of advice, what is your one bit of career advice that you would give to anyone?
Oh, so just general career advice. I would say relationships are key.
Okay. Yeah.
So I think probably with any career that you've got, building relationships with people and building that network around you, that's really important, I think. And develop that, and doing that as early as you possibly can, so that you then develop with those people and those contacts and those people that you know, and building those relationships. So I think that's really important, and I think that's probably something that I certainly say to our trainees and less experienced colleagues is go get out, make your relationships, build your relationships. I think that's really important.
Yeah, no, absolutely makes sense to me. I completely agree. Thank you very much for joining me. I hope you've enjoyed it.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Oh, it's been great. If you'd like to know more about Jill and the work that she does, please connect with her on LinkedIn. If you enjoyed listening to this, please subscribe. It really does make a difference in helping to grow the podcast and keeps us going. Next week, I'll be talking with William Peacock to find out exactly what a Dungeon Master does. Thank you.